I'd always considered myself an average person, just going through life, trying to keep my head above water. I wasn't someone who particularly struggled with stress or anxiety. I had my occasional worries, but nothing serious. That all changed about 2 years ago. It was the kind of event you never expect to happen to you, but when it does, it leaves a mark that takes a long time to heal. For me, it was the sudden collapse of my career path. At the time, I had been working in marketing at a mid-sized company in New York. Everything seemed to be going fine. Promotions were on the horizon, and I was seen as someone with a promising future. But then, one week, everything fell apart. A major project I'd been working on for months was suddenly scrapped. My boss was replaced, and with it came a complete restructuring of the team. I went from being in charge of a significant project to barely having a desk to sit at. I was shaken. In the blink of an eye, I went from being a successful professional to someone who was questioning everything about their abilities. The fear and doubt crept in, slowly at first, but then it began to build. The thoughts of inadequacy, the constant worry about my future, they became my constant companions. I started to lose sleep, couldn't focus at work, and felt overwhelmed by the simplest tasks. I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was just being weak. But I wasn't weak. I just didn't know how to deal with the anxiety that had taken over my life. Medication was an option that had been suggested, but I couldn't bring myself to try it. It wasn't the right path for me. I needed to find another way. And so my journey to understanding and managing anxiety began. As the days went on, I tried to keep a low profile at work. I didn't want to make waves, especially now that I felt like I was barely hanging on. The anxiety I felt began to seep into every aspect of my life. My interactions with co-workers became forced, and I stopped attending social events, avoiding any situation that might expose how fragile I felt. Then there was Lily. She had been with me through everything, through the highs and the lows, the successes and the failures. She had always been a steady presence, someone I could turn to when the world felt overwhelming. But even with her support, I found it difficult to talk about what I was going through. How could I explain the constant tension in my chest, the racing thoughts, the nagging fear that I wasn't good enough? I couldn't. I didn't want to burden her with my struggles, and so I kept quiet. But Lily knew. She always knew. Over time, I started to notice little things, a look in her eyes when she asked if I was okay, the way she'd linger just a bit longer when we said goodbye, as if she were waiting for me to open up. But I couldn't. I didn't have the words. I knew I had to do something. I had to get out of this spiral, and that was when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began researching ways to manage anxiety without medication. I read books, articles, and testimonials from people who had faced the same battles I was fighting. Slowly but surely, I realized that I wasn't alone. There were strategies and methods that worked for others, and I could make them work for me too. I started small, simple breathing exercises, learning to recognize the physical signs of anxiety before they took control. I would stop in the middle of a busy street or in the office bathroom and just breathe, focusing on my breath, grounding myself. The first few times, it didn't help much, but it felt like a lifeline. It gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt chaotic. I also started incorporating mindfulness into my routine. Every morning, I would take a few minutes to sit in silence, acknowledging the thoughts and feelings that came up without judgment. The simple act of acknowledging my anxiety instead of trying to fight it gave me a sense of control I hadn't had in months. At first, it felt awkward and forced, but the more I practiced, the more I began to notice the small shifts. I wasn't completely free of anxiety, but I was learning to manage it. I was taking back my life, one breath at a time. As weeks turned into months, I thought I was making progress. I had developed a routine, meditation in the mornings, exercise at night, and a healthier approach to my mental well-being. But just as things seemed to stabilize, I hit another roadblock. The pressures of my job began to intensify. The new management team had a different vision for the company, and I was caught in the middle of it all. They wanted results, fast, measurable progress. The pace was brutal, the expectations high. Suddenly, the small shifts I'd made to manage my anxiety didn't seem enough to keep me grounded. Every task felt like an overwhelming mountain, and I was back to that place where I felt like I was drowning. I started second-guessing everything I did. My work performance became riddled with self-doubt, and even small mistakes felt like failures. The anxiety that had once been manageable was now clouding my every thought. I'd find myself in the middle of a meeting, my heart racing, my palms sweating, wondering if anyone could see how broken I felt inside. I began to isolate myself even more, afraid to let anyone see how fragile I had become. Lily noticed the change. She had always been perceptive, but this time I couldn't hide it from her. One night after dinner, she gently asked, "Are you okay?" I didn't know how to answer. How could I tell her that I felt like I was falling apart again? How could I admit that I was losing control, even though I had promised myself that I wouldn't? Instead of responding right away, I just looked at her, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said. Lily didn't press me for an answer, but she didn't let me off the hook either. She was patient, but there was a quiet insistence in her gaze that told me she wouldn't back down. In that moment, something shifted. I realized that I had been running away from the very thing that I needed to face, my anxiety. I had been trying to manage it by controlling everything around me, but the truth was, I was never going to escape it. The only way out was through it. So, I made a decision. I would talk about it, with Lily, with my friends, and with my co-workers. I would stop pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. It was time to stop running. I began opening up more to Lily about my struggles, explaining how the pressure at work was triggering my anxiety, how I felt like I was constantly failing despite my best efforts. Her response was everything I needed to hear. "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be real." It wasn't easy. Admitting my vulnerabilities to the people around me was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also one of the most freeing. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I didn't have to carry the weight of my anxiety alone, and it was through these conversations that I started to realize something important. I didn't need to be flawless to be worthy. I didn't need to have everything figured out to be loved or respected. I just needed to be honest with myself and others. As I worked through the challenges at my job and my personal life, I began to notice how interconnected everything was. My anxiety wasn't just a product of my work stress or my lack of control. It was tied to deeper, older fears that I had been ignoring for years. It was only when I started opening up to others that I could see the full picture. One of the unexpected sources of support came from an unlikely place, my colleague, Mark. He had always seemed distant, the kind of person who was so focused on work that he barely spoke to anyone outside of meetings. But one day, during a coffee break, he casually mentioned that he had struggled with anxiety in the past. I was taken aback. Mark? The guy who always had everything together? It seemed impossible. But as he spoke about his own journey with anxiety, something clicked inside me. He wasn't immune to the struggles I was facing. He was just better at hiding it. And more importantly, he had found ways to manage it and without medication, just like I wanted to. We started talking more often, sharing tips and stories. Mark introduced me to a local support group for anxiety. It was something I hadn't considered before, meeting people face to face who were dealing with the same issues. I was hesitant at first, but there was something about Mark's sincerity that made me trust him. Joining the group, was one of the most transformative decisions I made. At first, I sat in the back, listening to others share their experiences. The room was full of people who seemed just like me, normal, everyday individuals who had been through their own struggles with anxiety. Some had lost jobs, others had faced personal tragedies, but we all shared the same fear, the fear of losing control. It was eye-opening. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was alone in this battle. We talked about practical strategies for managing anxiety, from grounding techniques to cognitive behavioral therapy exercises. But more importantly, we shared the emotional toll anxiety took on our lives. There was a raw honesty in that room, a sense of camaraderie that I had never experienced before. But as much as the group helped, I knew I couldn't rely on it entirely. It was a step, not a solution. I still had to find my own way of dealing with the pressures that came from all directions, at work, at home, and inside myself. Meanwhile, at work, the situation had grown more intense. My boss was pushing me harder than ever, demanding results that were often unattainable. The stress was starting to take its toll, and I felt like I was back where I started, overwhelmed and exhausted. I realized that the more I tried to fight the stress, the more it consumed me. It wasn't just about managing anxiety anymore. It was about setting boundaries. This realization came one afternoon during a meeting with my boss, Sarah. She was going over my latest project and pointing out the areas where I was falling short. I felt the familiar tension creeping up in my chest, the panic rising, but this time, something was different. I took a deep breath, looked her in the eye and said, "I can't do this anymore without some space. I need help." It was the first time I had ever been that direct with someone at work, but Sarah's response was surprising. She paused and then, with a slight nod, she said, "I understand. Let's work together on this." That conversation marked a turning point. It was the first step toward establishing a healthier balance between my personal well-being and my professional responsibilities. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt like a breakthrough. I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. I could ask for help, I could set boundaries, and most importantly, I could take care of myself without feeling guilty. The turning point came at the most unexpected moment. I had been feeling like I was making progress. I was talking to my co-workers more openly, attending my anxiety group, and even doing better at work with Sarah's support. But then, in one brief instant, everything came crashing down again. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was just settling into my office when I got an urgent email from Sarah. There was a major client presentation later that day, and she needed me to step in at the last minute. The presentation was huge. If we didn't impress this client, it could spell disaster for the company. I was already feeling the weight of my workload, and now, this. I felt the familiar surge of panic. My breath quickened, my hands started to shake, and I could feel my chest tightening. I immediately began doubting myself. What if I messed it up? What if I let everyone down? What if I failed again? But this time, something was different. For the first time in a long while, I stopped myself. I took a breath and tried to do what I had learned. I acknowledged the anxiety instead of trying to fight it. I knew that the panic wasn't going to help me. Instead, I focused on the present moment. I reminded myself that I had prepared for this kind of situation. I had the skills, the knowledge, and the support. I wasn't alone in this. As I walked into the meeting, I was still nervous, but I wasn't paralyzed by fear. I stood in front of the client, delivered my part of the presentation, and answered questions with a calm that surprised even me. The feedback we received was overwhelmingly positive. We had won the client over. I walked out of that meeting with my head held high, but more importantly, I walked out feeling something I hadn't in a long time: pride. I had faced my anxiety head-on and not let it control me. I had succeeded despite the fear. It wasn't a flawless victory, but it was a significant one. That moment changed everything. It showed me that anxiety wasn't something I had to run from. It was something I could face, acknowledge, and work with. I wasn't defined by my anxiety. It didn't have to control my life. In that moment, I realized that I had the power to take back control, and that power came from embracing the discomfort instead of avoiding it. After the presentation, things began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. The relief I felt from overcoming that anxiety-triggered moment didn't just vanish into thin air. Instead, it planted a seed of confidence that grew in unexpected directions. I had confronted my fears, and it had worked. Now, it felt like I could handle anything. At work, things were different. I felt empowered, capable of taking on challenges that would have once sent me into a spiral of panic. I stopped second-guessing myself so much, and when I did feel the familiar stirrings of anxiety, I had learned to manage them. I began using the coping techniques I picked up from the support group, grounding myself with deep breaths, focusing on the present, and reminding myself that anxiety didn't dictate my worth or my abilities. But as much as my professional life had started to improve, there was still something lingering in the background. I had made tremendous progress in handling my anxiety, but the people around me hadn't always kept up with my transformation. Most notably, Lily, who had been my rock throughout all of this, was beginning to show signs of frustration. She noticed the changes in me, the confidence, the ability to handle stress. But she also noticed that I had started to withdraw in other ways. I didn't realize it at first. I had been so focused on managing my anxiety that I hadn't noticed how I was distancing myself from her. I was no longer coming home to vent about the frustrations at work. Instead, I bottled things up, trying to deal with them on my own. And when she tried to talk to me, I brushed her off, too tired or too focused on keeping my anxiety at bay to engage in deeper conversations. One evening, she confronted me. We were sitting on the couch, the TV running in the background, and I could tell something was off. She turned to me and asked, "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" I looked at her, knowing what was coming. She wasn't asking about my work, or my anxiety, or my progress. She was asking if I was still present, if I was still the person she had been in love with. It hit me like a punch in the gut. I had spent so much time working on myself, trying to fix my anxiety, that I had forgotten the importance of the people who had been there for me all along. I had focused so much on getting better that I had neglected to keep the relationships that mattered most intact. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice small. "I've been so caught up in trying to manage everything that I didn't realize I was shutting you out." Lily's face softened. "I get it," she said, her voice full of understanding, "but you don't have to do this alone. I want to be here for you, to help you, but I need you to let me in." That was the moment I realized that healing wasn't just about managing anxiety on my own. It was about doing it with the people I loved and who loved me. I couldn't be afraid of letting others see the parts of me that still needed work. I didn't have to be perfect to deserve love and support. I had to be open. From that day forward, I made a conscious effort to reconnect with Lily. I started sharing more with her again, letting her know when I was struggling and leaning on her when I needed help. It wasn't easy, but I learned that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest, about being present in the moment, and about asking for support when I needed it. The change wasn't instant. There were still days when anxiety crept in, and there were moments when I struggled with vulnerability. But the difference was, I wasn't fighting it alone anymore. I had the tools, the support, and the self-awareness to navigate it. And I wasn't afraid to ask for help when I needed it. As the weeks passed, I felt the weight of anxiety gradually lifting. It wasn't a sudden change, but more of a slow, steady process. With each day, I became more comfortable with the tools I had learned, breathing techniques, grounding exercises, and even cognitive reframing. But most importantly, I learned how to stop seeing anxiety as an enemy. I'd come to understand that it wasn't something to be defeated. It was something to be managed, something that could coexist with me without taking control. The first big test came when I was asked to lead a major presentation in front of the entire company. It felt like a huge step forward, and I was both excited and terrified. The old me would have crumbled under the pressure, overwhelmed by the thought of speaking in front of so many people. But this time, I approached it differently. I prepared meticulously, but I didn't obsess over the details. I knew that no matter how much I prepared, there would always be variables I couldn't control. Instead of trying to eliminate the fear, I decided to accept it. I allowed myself to feel nervous, but I didn't let that anxiety dictate how I would perform. On the day of the presentation, I felt the familiar flutter of nerves in my stomach, but I didn't try to push it away. Instead, I took a few deep breaths before stepping into the room, grounding myself in the present moment. When I began speaking, I was nervous, but I didn't let that stop me. I focused on the message, on the value I could bring to the company, rather than on how I was perceived. The presentation went well. It wasn't flawless, but I delivered it confidently, and more importantly, I didn't let my anxiety control me. I could feel the growth within myself. The anxiety that used to paralyze me was no longer a barrier. It was something I had learned to work with, not something that defined me. The more I embraced this growth, the more I realized how much I had changed. I began to notice it in the small moments. The way I interacted with others, the way I handled setbacks, the way I allowed myself to be imperfect. It was liberating. But the biggest shift was in how I viewed myself. For the longest time, I had seen myself as weak for struggling with anxiety. I had internalized the belief that if I couldn't conquer it, I wasn't strong enough. But now, I realized the truth. Strength wasn't about eliminating fear or anxiety. It was about showing up anyway, despite the fear. It was about growing, learning, and evolving through the challenges. It was about embracing who I was, imperfect, anxious, but also resilient and capable. As I looked back on my journey, I saw how far I had come. I was no longer the person who let anxiety control every aspect of her life. I had learned to live alongside it, to acknowledge it without letting it hold me back. And while I still had difficult days, I now knew that I had the tools to face them. Anxiety would no longer be the defining factor of my life. I would be. With each passing day, I continued to grow, but I knew that I wasn't done yet. My transformation had been significant, but there were still areas of my life where anxiety had its grip. I was better at managing it, but I still had moments of self-doubt, especially when facing new challenges or unfamiliar situations. And now, something big was coming. A major project was approaching, one that would be the defining moment of my career. The company had secured an opportunity to collaborate with a high-profile client, and I was tasked with leading the entire initiative. This wasn't just a regular project. This was my chance to prove that I was capable of taking on big responsibilities, of leading with confidence, of showing that I had truly overcome the person I used to be. At first, the excitement was palpable. I dove headfirst into the project, meeting with clients, brainstorming ideas, and collaborating with the team. I was energized by the challenge and ready to show what I was capable of. But as the deadline loomed closer, the pressure began to mount. It was the same feeling I'd experienced so many times before, that tightness in my chest, that sense of everything hanging on the edge. The old me would have panicked, I thought. She would have stayed up late, overthinking every little detail, stressing herself out. But I was different now. I knew better than to let my mind spiral into worst-case scenarios. I remembered what I had learned from my therapist, Sarah, and the anxiety group. I couldn't control everything, and that was okay. I could only control how I reacted. Anxiety didn't mean I wasn't capable. It meant I was human. What mattered was how I chose to show up. As I prepared for the big day, I found myself feeling nervous, but I didn't let it take over. Instead of focusing on the pressure of the situation, I started focusing on the steps I needed to take. I broke the project into manageable parts and focused on what I could do in each moment. I used the techniques I'd learned: deep breathing, grounding myself in the present, and reminding myself that I had already faced bigger challenges. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, but there was still one thing I hadn't anticipated: the pressure from others. The closer we got to the presentation day, the more my co-workers and managers started checking in. They were all excited, expecting big things, but the weight of their expectations added a new layer of anxiety. They saw me as the success story, the one who had overcome so much. And while their faith in me was encouraging, it also made me feel like I couldn't afford to fail. Lily noticed my unease and sat me down one night. "You've got this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know you do. But don't forget that it's okay to have bad days. It's okay to not be perfect. You've come so far already." Her words were a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, and that I didn't have to do everything perfectly. My value didn't come from how flawlessly I handled challenges. It came from my willingness to show up even when I was scared, even when I felt vulnerable. In that moment, I realized that I had everything I needed to succeed. I had the skills, the support, and the determination to push through. The only thing left was to show up and face whatever came next, not as the perfect, anxiety-free version of myself, but as someone who had learned to thrive despite the fear. The day had finally arrived. The project presentation, the moment I had worked so hard for. The pressure was intense, but this time I felt ready. In the past, I would have been paralyzed by fear, consumed by the thought of all the things that could go wrong. But now I had a different mindset. I knew I couldn't control everything, but I could control how I responded to the situation. Walking into the conference room, I could feel the nerves creeping up on me again, like old friends reminding me of my past. But I didn't try to push them away. Instead, I welcomed them as a sign that I was human. I allowed myself to feel the anxiety without letting it take over. I took a deep breath, centered myself in the moment, and focused on the task at hand. As I stood before the team, the client, and all the decision makers, I realized that this was my moment to show everything I had learned. The old me would have faltered, but not today. Today, I had tools, strategies, and the confidence to trust myself. I began the presentation with a calm voice, laying out the strategy and vision. The slides clicked into place and I kept my focus, reminding myself that I was prepared. But then something unexpected happened. Mid-presentation, I felt the familiar sensation of anxiety creeping up, like a dark cloud that threatened to overwhelm me. My heart rate spiked and I stumbled over a few words. The room felt suddenly too small, the eyes of everyone on me too intense. The fear that I was going to mess up, that I wasn't good enough, threatened to take over. For a moment, I was frozen. It was as if the clock had stopped, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. But then I remembered everything I had learned. I remembered the tools, the deep breaths, the grounding techniques. I focused on my breath and gave myself permission to pause. I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to keep going. With that thought, I steadied myself and picked up where I had left off. I continued the presentation, pushing through the discomfort. I could feel the tension in my chest, but I no longer saw it as a barrier. It was a sign that I was on the right path. I was doing this. I was pushing through despite the fear, and that was enough. As the presentation came to an end, I looked up and saw that the client was nodding, clearly impressed. The team was engaged, asking questions and offering positive feedback. I had done it. I had faced my anxiety and delivered under pressure. It wasn't a flawless presentation, but it was authentic. It was me showing up, vulnerable yet determined, and that was enough. When the meeting concluded, I stepped out of the room, my hands shaking, but my heart soaring. I had just done something I once thought was impossible. I had faced my anxiety head-on and turned it into something productive. I had proven not just to others, but to myself, that I could thrive despite my fears. The weight I had carried for so long had lifted, and in its place was a sense of pride I had never known. Looking back on everything I had accomplished, it was hard to believe how far I had come. A year ago, anxiety had been a shadow hanging over my every move, dictating the direction of my life. It had shaped my decisions, limited my experiences, and made me feel small and powerless. But now, I was standing on the other side, looking at the person I had become. Someone who had faced those fears, confronted those obstacles, and come out stronger. The work presentation had been a pivotal moment, but it wasn't the end of my journey. It was just a milestone, a testament to how much I had grown. It showed me that I didn't need to wait for anxiety to disappear to move forward. Instead, I could keep going, keep pushing, and keep evolving even with it by my side. What I had learned was profound. Anxiety didn't define me. It didn't make me weak or incapable. It made me human. The key wasn't in trying to completely eliminate it, but in learning how to coexist with it, to manage it, and to not let it control my life. The more I embraced this reality, the more freedom I found. Anxiety didn't own me anymore. As I stood at the threshold of a new chapter in my life, I felt a sense of peace that had been foreign to me for so long. The tools I had learned, mindfulness, self-compassion, self-awareness, they had become second nature. They were no longer just techniques, they had become a part of who I was. I had learned to trust myself, to trust my ability to handle whatever came my way. There were still tough days. Anxiety didn't just vanish, but it no longer held the power it once had. It was simply a part of life, something I could handle. I had transformed not by eradicating it, but by learning to live with it, to thrive in spite of it. And that, to me, was true freedom. As I reflected on my journey, I realized that I had gained something far more valuable than just the ability to manage anxiety. I had gained confidence, resilience, and the knowledge that I was capable of facing whatever life threw at me. Most importantly, I had learned that I was worthy of success, worthy of love, and worthy of a life free from the shackles of fear. In the end, I hadn't just beaten anxiety. I had found a way to live with it, and that made all the difference.